What's up, guys? I am War Master Moloch, and this is kind of a discussion and speculation video about upcoming DLC for Total War Warhammer, about a character who I think is definitely going to be appearing in the series sooner rather than later, hopefully sooner, and that is the first vampire and the ruler of the Lahmian Sisterhood, Neferata. The video is kind of inspired by and in response to a video on the same subject by the Great Book of Grudges, which I've linked to in the description. He's far more of a lore guy than I am and goes into deeper depth about the character, so that video is well worth checking out if you want kind of a deeper take on the character. Either I'm mostly going to be talking about gameplay and the kinds of mechanics that I think she should come out with when she is inevitably brought into the series, because the more I've thought about her, the more I've come to realise that she could potentially become one of the best characters in the game and could also not only enrich the vampire counts as a faction, but the overall flavour and themes of every faction that she comes into contact with in the game. So I'll start out by giving you a quick overview of the character just in case you don't know all that much about her. So as I mentioned, Neferata is the first vampire. She's an ageless beauty who was born in Neferata, reputedly one of the most, or possibly the most beautiful woman in the Warhammer world. She drank the elixir of life and found herself in service to Nagash before his fall. And on a side note, she's also the first wife of Vlad von Carstein. And that means that Vlad has married not one, but two of the most beautiful women in Warhammer, and is therefore far, far cooler than Manfred, who is bald and basically caused the end of the world. What a dick. That's a sideline. Back to Neferata. She rules from a fortress in the World's Edge Mountains called the Silver Pinnacle, and from there she pulls the threads of a political web of intrigue that she's spread across the whole world, manipulating events and people in every corner of it. So basically, imagine if Lord Varys from Game of Thrones still didn't have balls, but was far cooler, far, far more powerful, and far, far, far more attractive. That's Neferata. So, having built her up like that, how do we do justice to a character of that magnitude in the Total War Warhammer series? Now, I propose some mechanics that would not only buff Neferata herself, but also the vampire counts as a faction, while also, on top of all that, adding colour, themes and immersion to the game as a whole. And the best part is, none of it will be particularly hard for CA to implement, nor even a talented modder to do so, because everything I'm going to be proposing has been implemented already in another form, kind of reskinning but enhancing things that they've already got in. So let's get into that. So first thing you might be thinking looking at this screen is, why am I looking at high elves? This is supposed to be a video about a vampire. Well, over here with Eltharion the Grim and Ivres are the first two related mechanics that I would repurpose for Neferata, those being the Wardens Cage and the Prison of Athel Tamara. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the Wardens Cage in action, show you the Prison of Athel Tamara, and then explain how I would repurpose them for Neferata's use. So let's get into that. So, we're in the battle and everything's going pretty much how you would expect it to. We're shooting up a bunch of gobbos, and over here we have the Warden's Cage ready to go. So let's try and trigger that when we get the chance. Let's finish this lot off as soon as possible. Now he's taken an absolute beating. Once he's about to break, we will trigger the cage. In fact, it looks like he's about to go down now, so let's just do it now. There, the cage has dropped on him. We now have 30 seconds to knock him out, basically, or else we'll have to kill him or he can retreat. There we go. So it says he's dead, but we've actually captured and imprisoned him in the Prison of Athel Tamara. That's exactly what we wanted. And there's the demo. So let's just let them finish up there. So first thing I would say about how I would have the Warden's Cage mechanic work for Neferata. So I would change the name to something like Enchanting Beauty or Hypnotic Beauty, something like that. That takes the same mechanic but gives it a bit of a vampire spin. So the way it would work is if Neferata or one of the Lahmian Sisterhood is on the battlefield, they can trigger the cage when the general or the hero that they want to do it to is close enough to them. So when they can get a line of sight with them, and the idea is that they mesmerize them by catching them with that kind of, the classic vampire gaze or glare that they give in movies that just freezes someone in place. They go with that, and that puts the general in a trance, or the hero, for 30 seconds, and then you get the chance to capture them rather than having to kill them or let them retreat from the battlefield to win the battle. If you manage to do it, they get transferred to a new version of the prison of Athel Tamara, which we'll call something like the Dungeons of the Silver Pinnacle, just as a placeholder name for it. And then you go into the dungeon menu, which we'll be looking at the moment. The important thing to remember, though, is that you have to have a Lahmian on there because it represents the power of Neferata's sisterhood. So if she's not there, or one of her closest henchwomen isn't there, you can't trigger the ability. Also, unlike Eltharien's Warden's Cage, you can't just trigger it anywhere. They have to be close enough that the vampiress can make line of sight contact with them and therefore mesmerize them. So it's a bit harder to trigger, and you can only use it under certain circumstances, but the effects can be great once you've got them into the prison, and we'll discuss those next. So there you go. We have captured Ratgash Bootlicker, and he is in the prison of Athel Tamara. So let's go and have a look at that. We've already explained the cage mechanic. Now let's have a look at the prison. So here's your boy Ratgash. We're going to ignore all this stuff around the side here. I'm not particularly interested in that. I see it more as a captivity type situation with Neferata, because with her it's all about politics, and politics is all about people. So it's about how she uses her captives. So here with Eltharien you have three options: indoctrinate, execute, and eventually interrogation. I'm going to go with something more thematic for Neferata, which will give you four options. So the first one will be keeping indoctrinate. You get fewer things from it with her because there's no like warden supply or influence mechanic that I'm looking to add with Neferata. Instead, what you get is that percentage of the character's faction treasury per turn when you release them back to that faction as a puppet, and you also still get the line of sight that you get with Eltharion. So that's option number one, indoctrinate. The second one is where we start to get more vampire thematic, and that one is feed. So for this one, either Neferata or one of her generals of your choosing feeds on the prisoner for 5 turns. This then gives them personally a temporary boost in hit points, leadership, and combat stats. So they get supercharged a bit. They're harder to kill, they're harder to fight. Maybe you could throw in things like fear when fighting that captured character's faction. Something like that. Just thematic stuff based upon a feeding mechanic. After 5 turns, the prisoner is finally drained and dies, and the general who has been feeding on them returns to their normal stats. So option number 3 is enslave. So for this, Neferata is deemed to have drained them enough of their blood to subjugate them and turn them into a slave, but she hasn't given them the blood kiss. So that would then turn them into a follower that can be assigned to a general that gives certain buffs. Like I say, it could cause terror for a faction that they've come from, or it could boost monsters. They'd have like different stats for different races. You could have like a few different versions for each particular race. So there could be a few versions for Empire Slave or Bretonnian Slave. So one could boost, a Bretonnian one could boost some cavalry, for example, or trade or melee attack stats. And that follower can obviously be assigned to any general at any time, and you can switch them about. So it's a bit less it's a bit more flexible than feed, but has a level of permanence because you can keep that. But you can also lose the slave, obviously, if the general loses in battle potentially. So the way I'm envisioning it is that They are useful to Neferata, but not useful enough to deserve the blood kiss. They are pawns in her game for her to sacrifice according to her whims. So she turns them into slaves. And the last option is convert, and this is where she actually employs the blood kiss. And it's for captured generals only. So with this, she gives the captive the blood kiss and turns them into a fully fledged vampire general capable of leading an army. Their skill tree will be changed to that of a generic vampire lord, but they will still retain their old skill level, and you'll be able to assign their old skill points into the new tree according to your wishes. Obviously, this would introduce the Confederation skill point respec option that we've all been crying out for years, so it will benefit the game as a whole if that kind of mechanic comes in, because it would kind of backdoor add in the option for that Confederation skill point mechanic. Benefits everyone, and it's also great thematically for Neferata. So in addition to the normal generic vampire lord trees that these converts would get, I would also add in a thematic skill tree with buff options. For example, if you convert a Bretonnian lord, you can add skill points into options that can boost cavalry, make him more dangerous against former faction. For a Norscan, you could boost monsters. There's a lot of scope here to be playful and really add colour into the game. You could also like add terror for their old faction. You know, the visual impact of the populace and the armies of this faction that you're fighting, seeing one of their great generals reduced to a vampire who is now fighting against them, it would have a real effect upon them. And obviously you can give those kind of thematic names like Scourge of Men and things like that. Now, complications for the last two, especially the last one, come from legendary lords and creatures from other races. So legendary lords are immortals and there are no vampires from other races in the game as it stands. However, we can get around these issues. The Prison of Athel Tamara does not actually execute legendary lords, even though you can trigger the execute option. You still get buffs, so there's a bit of flexibility there. So your options could be to either not let enslave or convert be used on legendary lords or other races, or alternatively you could spawn a generic lord or hero in place of the one supposedly being enslaved or converted. A generic lord, I should say, rather than hero, because they can't be converted, they can only be turned into followers. And in the event that they don't really fit with followers, like say for example you wouldn't really have a Tomb King slave because they disintegrate, you could have it like they're reduced to an ornament, like a skull trinket, Tomb King skull ornament, that gives you the same buffs as if it were a follower. But with regard to the lords, as I say, you could either spawn a generic lord in their place, and then the legendary lord goes back to their faction, same as happens with the Prison of Athel Tamara. But you could have them get extra buffs because they've come from a legendary lord, so they could give severe public order deficits in the territories of the faction that you're fighting when this new lord enters, because he's supposedly of that bloodline, causing terror and things like that, just to reflect that fear that I was discussing earlier of seeing the greatest general, like say Karl Franz for example. Obviously it's very unlikely that we'll be able to code in an option whereby you can make Karl Franz a vampire lord. If it's possible, that would be great. That would be a really superb mechanic to add in, because Neferata could conceivably have like this entire menagerie of great generals that she's accumulated from across the world. But in the event that that can't be done, you just go with a generic version which has extra buffs for having been converted from a legendary lord. So that's how I would see the Prison of Athel Tamara working. And with that in mind, let's give some thought to something that reflects the most important part of Neferata's faction, politics and intrigue. And for that, I've got something very interesting. Nathan from the Great Book of Grudges suggested repurposing the influence mechanic, but I'm going a bit more ambitious than that. The high-off influence mechanic, that is. I've got something a bit more in-depth, a bit more fun, and with a lot more potential. So let's discuss that. So for representing Neferata's political scheming, I don't need an elf or a vampire to demonstrate it. What I need is a rat, and one specific rat, your boy Queek Headtaker. So let's head on down here. There is Queek there, but it's not him we really want to look at. We want to go north to Karak Eight Peaks, because there he has himself an undercity, and that's what I propose repurposing for Neferata's political element. So what it would do is kind of reskin the undercity mechanic as what I would tentatively refer to as a vampire cabal. So you send an agent, same as the Skaven, to set up a cabal at a city, or you can set one up after attacking a settlement and choosing not to sack, raze, or occupy it, exactly as the Skaven do. And you can then build items under that cabal menu that can do things like lower public order and growth, spread vampiric corruption, steal money, make it harder to find, a whole host of other things. So if you have a look at here in these menus, for example, food generated, Skaven corruption, and there's a certain level of discoverability. That could be like a public order reduction for Neferata, or obviously there would be vampiric corruption associated with it, or getting more money, which you can do with other Skaven buildings as well. There are buildings which increase spread potential, so it could have the option to spread more cabals around other cities. So there's a load of potential there for a host of things that can benefit Neferata. It can improve or reduce relations with a faction, for example, or she could use it to foster relations, either good or bad, with other factions. Like, say, she could provoke poorer relations between, say, if we use Karak Eight Peaks as an example, so the Crooked Moon Mutinous Gits, she could make it so that they have even worse relations with Karak Azul to try and prompt a war there if it benefits her through building a building in her Vampire Cabal stroke Undercity mechanic. But the way I see it as well, you could also give her options to positively affect a city and a faction. So she could give them good public order, like buff it. She could improve their garrison, improve their relations. That in that way would really reflect the politicking and the nuance of it. So she's not always negative, she can be positive. Because, for example, let's say she's spread down to Black Crag, she might really want Crooked Moon Mutinous Gits to hold out against Karak Azul, because Karak Azul might be about to come for her. So she might then boost that up. Or a better example, say she has issues with Queek coming up. She might want to stop him from getting Karak Eight Peaks. So she might build buildings that improve the public order for the Crooked Moon Mutinous Gits, give them money, or improve her relations with them to build up an alliance. So that would really reflect the way in which Neferata pulls the strings around the world for her own benefit. So being an ally with her might not necessarily a bad thing at all if she wants your faction to remain strong, or she wants an AI faction to remain strong. She can lower their army upkeep, stuff like that. The potential's obvious. The more you talk about it, there's just scope for so much that you could do with a character like Neferata. And here's the thing as well, the Cabal mechanic could potentially cross over into other vampire factions too. Personally, I would water them down for others, but you could have Cabals available to other vampires with like reduced quality to the buildings, like they get lower public order negatives, less money, less vampiric corruption. They'd be like watered down versions, perhaps. It's not essential that they have it at all, but it's just a way in which that could be implemented. They might not get the option to positively affect a settlement like Neferata can in order to foster alliances. They could just be like a vampire plague, like you would expect them to be, but a weaker one than the ones that Neferata can create. Hell, you could maybe even give them the Cage and Prizik mechanic too, only without the opportunity to convert generals. So they might be able to create followers as an absolute maximum, but they can't get those high level generals via converting Karl Franz or whoever. I keep picking on Karl Franz, but yeah, he'd be a good one to convert, wouldn't he? There is so much potential there through Neferata to boost the vampire counts as a faction and really drive home the themes and the idea of the vampire counts and the way that they work, but especially the idea of the Lahmian Sisterhood. Even if none of this stuff spreads to other vampire factions, it could make the Lahmian Sisterhood absolutely fantastic. So much fun to play, and very importantly, so much fun to have them in your area. Well, possibly fun. We'll get into that in the next part. So, I was talking about Neferata adding colour to the Total War Warhammer world and having potential positive fun effects for you when you're not playing as her, but also I hinted at some possible negative effects. Obviously, she could become an enemy, but there's more in the ideas that I have here, and I'm going to tell you now where I was going with that. And it all revolves around alliances with positives and potentially devastating negatives. And the best way for me to outline it all is to put you in the place of the player who is playing as Imric. Just because he's essentially a heroic character who is relatively close to Neferata. So imagine you're playing as him. So you've got Snikch over in the east. You've got Malice down south somewhere. Yep, there's Malice. And you've got Grimgor's Ardboys surely going to show up sooner or later with a big load of Black Orc spam, as you used to. You're surrounded by enemies and you're under real pressure and you're struggling to hold onto your territory. You've managed to take a province, so you've got yourself all the way around there to Ashridge Mountains, but the enemies are closing in around you. And you're fighting them off, but it's getting harder and harder each time. Your replenishment's taking more time. They've besieged your capital, say. You're in trouble. And then next turn, after the end turn, an offer comes in, and it's an alliance with the Lahmian Sisterhood. She's come down south and she's offered you an alliance. And you accept it because you badly need a friend right now, and they are really good friends to have. What you get for taking the alliance with her is you automatically receive a public order boost and some extra trade income, but also a bit of vampiric corruption, and growth drops a little. So this is because you're accepting the alliance establishes a vampire cabal in your capital. So they'll boost your trade, they'll help you keep order in the city, which will let you move your armies around more. But there's a percentile chance of that cabal spreading to other settlements, and you lose growth because, well, vampires get hungry, don't they? So there are positives and negatives, but those positives are giving you the option to spread out and start to fight your enemies more, and the money to do it as well, a little bit extra money from that extra trade income. So you're able to fight back, and maybe even possibly you get a couple of extra units in your garrison, like say maybe a couple of units of Graveguard, say. Maybe that wouldn't be possible to code in and you'd have to have like an extra couple of units of Elven garrison, but your garrison gets a little bit better because your friend Neferata is helping you out, and she does it in more ways than that as well. So imagine like events popping up. You all know how the events pop up like this. It gives you a little story and tells you what's been happening and what the effect is. So let's use this one for an example. I've got a few examples that I've written down. Insurrection thwarted. Duration 5 turns. The Lahmian Sisterhood have uncovered a plot to depose you and bring an end to your just rule. They have put an end to these schemes, and the traitors are now unwilling food for the undead. Public order +4. Positive thing to have. Another one. Booming trade. Duration 4 turns. Neferata's contacts in Ulthuan have ensured that shipments of fine silks, precious metals and rare exotic beasts find their way to your markets and not those of your rivals. Growth +20, income from trade +5%, treasury +1000. So this is you benefiting from an alliance with the most politically connected woman in all the Warhammer world. But on the flip side of that, when you've got the alliance with her, there are risks and dilemmas too. So if you break an alliance with Neferata, you get a massive relations hit with her, and you lose all the public order and money buffs that you were getting. However, the vampiric corruption and growth debuffs remain until you find and destroy the cabals, which depends on luck and being able to afford to do it, same as with Skaven Undercities. And if she builds hostile structures as a part of her cabal, things will get even worse for you. You know, it's like if she attacks you, there might be additional units there. Maybe she gets zombie spawns. Like if you imagine the Skaven Menace below, maybe she gets a zombie equivalent of that, where she can pop up zombies on top of your artillery, for example, because she's built these buildings as a part of her cabal before she attacks you. So it's easy, right? You make an alliance with Neferata and you just keep her sweet. Well, it's not going to be as easy as that, because as well as positive events, there can also be negative events. For example, Blood Under Moonlight, duration 3 turns. Several homes in the poorer parts of town have become suddenly vacant, with not a trace of their former occupants, save for the occasional bloody handprint on the floor. Their neighbours are growing fearful, and some speak openly of leaving for safer lands. Growth -25, public order -2. See the themes here. These pop-up events are really vampire thematic. They add to the atmosphere of being allied with a vampire faction. How it can really help you, but it can also start to hurt you, and there's a growing danger in your territory. And just to amp up the pressure even more, there could be randomly generated dilemmas that put your alliance with Neferata to the test. So as an example of that, we have an insult to our allies. So your general, let's call him Altharion, has unwisely allowed himself to be heard speaking ill of our vampire allies in a tavern. He must be punished lest our alliance be compromised. So you get 2 options, one positive, one negative, theoretically. So option 1, punish the general. He gets permanent debuffs of leadership -3 for himself, leadership -5 for all units in his army, and upkeep cost +10% for all units in his army. So that's if you decide to punish the general. The alternative is to ignore the Lahmian complaints. Immediate relations drop with the Lahmian Sisterhood of -20. And then for 5 turns, public order -3 in all provinces, growth -20 in all provinces, and income from trade -5%. This would reflect Neferata and the Sisterhood being angry with you and withdrawing their aid in your cities to punish you for disobeying them. But it can get even worse than that. So a big one here. The dilemma would be called a call for justice. When unwisely investigating the activities of the Lahmian Sisterhood in Fortress of Vorag, your general Eltharion was detected, and in his attempt to escape slew one of Queen Neferata's most trusted aides. She demands he be delivered to her for a suitably long and eventually fatal punishment. Your options are to either bow to Neferata's demands or break the alliance. So option 1, bow to Neferata's demands. The general dies permanently, even if he's immortal. And then for 4 turns, the upkeep costs of all armies go up by 5% to reflect the discontent in your military, but your public order goes up by 4% because the Lahmian Sisterhood are keeping order for you, and they're redoubling their efforts because you've proven yourself a close ally. The alternative one, break the alliance. The alliance is broken with the Lahmian Sisterhood. All benefits of alliance lost, so you lose those public order buffs you are getting, you lose the trade buffs, etc, etc. And for 5 turns, you receive a further public order negative of 5 in all provinces, and you lose 20% income from trade. So you're getting a choice: sacrifice a general who you've built up and spec'd, or lose an alliance that gives you significant benefits and potentially wind up with insurrections everywhere, serious financial losses, and maybe even a war with Neferata herself. So it becomes a double-edged sword. You can make a lot by being allied with Neferata, but if she turns on you or you anger her, you could pay for it with the cost of your entire campaign pretty much. And you wind up having to make sacrifices like giving up the generals that you've really worked hard to develop, and you lose them permanently. I'm sure you see the potential there. It's really thematically interesting, and there's loads of potential for just fun mechanics, frustrating mechanics, and real challenges and serious decisions that you have to make in a campaign, that all comes from giving this one faction those little bits of extra that really make them feel like vampires. So the more time I've spent thinking about what Neferata can add, the more excited I've become about her coming edition. Hopefully we'll be seeing her soon, and if we do, mechanics like the ones that I've outlined in this video could really improve the entire game. So hopefully CA are thinking along these lines, or if they haven't started work on her yet, might even take suggestions like these from me and other players on board, because mechanics like Hypnotic Beauty and the Vampire Cabal, as I have described them, could really enrich the game and make, at the very least, it would make the Lahmian Sisterhood a fantastic faction to play as, but it could really turn the east of the map into the vampire stronghold that, let's face it, we'd really enjoy it being, just because it would be a lot more fun. And that's what I focus upon, is just the fun of the faction, the fun of the characters, and the challenge that they can give me if I wind up fighting them, or, as I was discussing a minute ago, allying with them. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it interesting. If you have, it'd be a big help if you could hit like and subscribe. I'd really like to know what you guys think and what suggestions you would have for Neferata and the Lahmian Sisterhood. So stick your thoughts down in the comments section and let's talk about vampires, and most important of all, how much of an incel Manfred is. I want to thank you guys for your time, and hopefully I shall see you in the next one. Have a good one.